If you read anything online about video games, then you know that there's only two games in existence. As shown by one of the greatest minds today, Don Quixote, games are either Dark Souls or Zelda.
Like it. Dishonored, Hitman, Outer Wilds, and even Dark Souls among them.
You know the elevator pitch. Do a Dark Souls, but make it anime.
The elevator pitch for Remnant is basically Dark Souls with a heavy focus on ranged, gun-based combat.
Ashen shamelessly borrows the major trappings of Dark Souls.
It's a genre remix that samples the combat and exploration of a lightened-up Dark Souls.
Chicory is best described as a top-down, Zelda-like adventure.
It's clearly inspired by reverence for The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Genshin Impact and its expansive world clearly draw inspiration from The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Glide slowly through the air and climb any surface with a slowly depleting stamina bar, because Breath of the Wild made it so that that's just in every open world game now.
However, there is one game that is split between being either. Yes, I believe the great philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once pondered this exact question. Is Elden Ring the Dark Souls of Breath of the Wild, or the Breath of the Wild of Dark Souls? Look, I gotta start with the easier philosophical stuff because this question is more easily comprehended than the phrase l'existence brise les gens. Because it is more effective for people to pitch games by using game titles as descriptors rather than actual adjectives. But it's to the point that these descriptors debase games so much that it loses all meaning, and we're all to blame. To better understand the gravity of the implications this question posits, we first need to define what makes a game Dark Souls or Breath of the Wild. To me, the essence of Dark Souls is adaptability. It certainly is challenging, but never impossible. When I first played Dark Souls, I remember encountering the Asylum Demon and wasting almost an hour fighting him with the broken sword. Given the reputation that Dark Souls is a difficult game, I accepted the fight as is while contemplating my refund of the game. I then accidentally rolled through a gate and was cut off from the fight. It was then that I realized that I was not meant to fight the demon, but that I was meant to... This taught me the valuable lesson that the game would be fair, mostly. The game wasn't so much about playing by the rules, but understanding the rules and knowing how to overcome them. Exploit them even. The law of equivalent exchange almost applies to Dark Souls. The game might seem rigid at first, but once you come to understand the rules and the limits of the game, you can start to mold yourself around the game, and the game can mold around you. What I mean is, say you come into the game with the expectation that you can jump. However, there is no jumping, at least not traditionally. The game won't allow you to jump that way because that's not how the game was designed. But if you remain insistent about jumping in the game, then little to no progress can be made. The game will then be passed off as a dumb, terrible experience. However, once you come to the realization that jumping isn't quite how it's like in other games, then you can move on. And look, I'm not defending the jumping in Dark Souls. It is clunky. This is just an example. This understanding applies to everything in the game. Once you understand that you can level up or backstab, then you can bend the game to your will. The character leveling system is fantastic because you can tailor your experience with the game. Find that you take too much damage? Then increase your health or defense. Find that you run out of stamina too often? Then increase your endurance. Find that you're too weak? You get the idea. This level of customization gives me a sense of freedom that I don't even experience from playing Breath of the Wild. You could grind if you want, but I find that enough experience can be gained from just repeatedly running back to the boss or exploring other areas. And if you hit a wall in progress, you can level up or summon an ally to help. You don't have to be stuck fighting a boss endlessly. The game is opaque, but understanding is key to playing the game, and thankfully many external resources exist to help with that. I also love the Souls style of combat so much. It's deliberate and exact. Actual impact can be applied and received. It feels good to do damage to enemies instead of just scratching them like in other games. I mean, look at all the stuff I'm doing to kill a rat versus but I just killed a man. Some games I don't even realize I'm taking damage. But with Dark Souls... Yep, I'm definitely going to feel that in the morning. Every hit matters, so being able to dodge, shield, and parry adds more to the dynamics of combat. Despite the challenge, I still feel that I'm in control and that most of the deaths are my fault. I just messed up the timing, or I didn't recognize the patterns of an attack yet. The bosses are also great, with such iconic characters like Ornstein and Smo, and Great Wolf Sif. One thing that contributes to making each fight memorable is the soundtrack. Dark Souls' soundtrack is unique in that it's only present during boss fights and certain areas. Most of the game is actually silent, so each boss encounter is easily heightened by the music alone. And with how tough some bosses are, their themes can easily become ingrained through rote repetition. The final boss, Gwyn, is also made more iconic by his theme. With all the other bosses having bombastic and exciting music, I knew the final boss will be an absolute banger. Or so I thought. Before you even get hit by the boss, you get hit by 3 piano chords. The whiplash from the change in tone was stunning. It struck me that there was much more behind this fight, except I had no idea what it was. Which leads to how opaque the story itself is. If you want to talk about difficulty, deciphering the narrative and lore of Dark Souls is more difficult than playing the game. But this isn't a criticism. I applaud how the story is uniquely presented through the background rather than the foreground. It takes a step back and just lets you find the story yourself should you choose to, or allow you to focus on your own story. For me, the game has this meta-narrative asking why do I play. Every time I am punished by the game, it elicits the question, why do I continue? I knew this game would be challenging, yet why do I persist? I fell in love with 2 games that were inspired by Dark Souls, Hollow Knight and Jedi Fallen Order. I reasoned that if I liked these games so much, I might as well try the source, regardless of how difficult it might be. But it was so depressing playing the game at first, especially during the pandemic. I already felt powerless, so being further punished by a game didn't help. Also, I didn't realize that I was playing with the Dark Souls of controllers because these Joy-Cons kept actively trying to kill me. But I had nothing else better to do, so I persisted and adapted. Eventually, I was able to overcome every single obstacle that stood in my way, no matter how brutal each defeat was, and I no longer became powerless. Each victory over every obstacle gave me so much satisfaction. Dark Souls helped me find strengths through weakness and rekindled my flame to push through whatever came my way. That was my story. As for the actual narrative of the game, I don't know. The story is almost felt before it is understood, much like my fight with Gwyn. I had no idea who this guy was or what he did, but it definitely is tragic. Almost as tragic as how easy he was. That's it. However, the greatest tragedy of all is that the soundtracks are no longer available on streaming services. Adaptability in Dark Souls is what defines the games for me. To mold into it so that it may reciprocate. It's a game that's opaque, but filled with great environments, systems, bosses, soundtracks, and stories. I know that Dark Souls inspired a whole genre, so maybe these articles are talking about Souls-like games, or at least games that borrow some elements. Maybe a game mechanic that can actually be accurately compared to Dark Souls. Alright, let's see some articles comparing games to Dark Souls. I see. It's like Dark Souls in that you'll definitely want to play with a gamepad. Fall Guys, eh? There's a lot of rolling in that, I can see that. Donkey Kong Country. Lots of rolling in that too, but I'll admit that these articles are losing me. Oh, okay, Ghost of Tsushima isn't Dark Souls. Must be Breath of the Wild then. Crash Bandicoot. You die a lot, and the controls just mean that Crash Bandicoot has become Dark Souls. Okay, I think I'm getting it. Yes. Uh-huh. Yep. I see. Okay. Alright. Yep. I see. Alright, it seems that I was wrong about Dark Souls. None of the nuance really matters in making a game Dark Souls. It seems that the essence of Dark Souls is that it's just hard, and that all of these diverse games are united under the banner of Dark Souls because they are also hard. Looks like it don't even gotta be a game. So there you go. To be Dark Souls, the game's gotta be hard. To me, the essence of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is freedom. Almost everything that Breath of the Wild introduces to the Zelda franchise is added to emphasize freedom in some way. From the basic ability to jump with the press of a button, to the dynamic physics system implemented. I remember first seeing gameplay and having a visceral reaction to seeing Link ragdoll for the first time. It was both shocking and hilarious to see Link tumble after taking a blow from a bokoblin. The physics adds a literal freedom in movement and allows you to have fun with various mechanics. The more obvious way that the game emphasizes freedom is traversal. There's a vast open world for you to explore, and you can do so from any direction. But it's not just about exploring a wide plane. The game also adds mechanics for the freedom of vertical movement. You can climb almost every surface all the way to the peak, and then safely glide down. Of course, this all comes at a cost. There are systems in place to limit you, such as stamina, enemy placement, and of the most infamous, weapon durability. Sure, you're free to try out all sorts of weapons in Hyrule, but they're all as strong as my will to live once you toss them. Each limitation is done to keep you on your toes. The game wouldn't be as engaging if it was constantly empty or easy. Early weapons are rusted and weak, encouraging this scrappy playstyle. It allows you to familiarize yourself with each weapon type as you scrounge for anything to defend yourself with. And having weapons break as soon as you throw them adds a risk and reward for extra damage and stagger, similar to jumping with the last bit of stamina to reach up to a ledge. Although it's annoying to have weapons constantly break, it prevents you from hoarding too many early game weapons. Not enough to stop hoarding in general though. However, I do wish there was a blacksmith that can repair any weapon you want to keep, as well as a meter for how many uses a weapon has left. Climbing in the rain is also awful, but these moments can allow ingenuity to spark. I remember trying to find a way for the rain to stop, so I made a campfire underneath a ledge to pass the time. I was impressed by my own brilliance when I finally got a fire started and could continue climbing. Often freedom comes with some burdens, even freedom itself can be a burden, but accepting that helps you pursue whatever goal you set. The open structure of the game allows for more freedom, especially when compared to other games, even open world. The best way for me to compare them is by making these diagrams and explaining each of them. So first one here is real simple. These are the linear games. So here's the start and the end, and the game must be played in a specific order to beat it. So this is stuff like Call of Duty or The Last of Us or whatever. Just games that have chapters and levels that you need to beat in sequential order. Right, and obviously there's nothing wrong with that. Linear games are of course still fun. Next are your open world games. So this is stuff like GTA or Assassin's Creed, where you have a start and an end, and a big open world to play in. So the circle represents the open world, and I could spend hours in this world. But if I want to beat the game, I would have to play certain levels. After each level, it spits you back out into the open world, and I could continue spending hours messing around or doing side quests. But the game won't end until I do all the main quests. So I could streamline through the game and do every main mission and even ignore the open world to beat the game. But I can't explore the world and ignore the main missions to beat the game. Actually, some games won't let you streamline through the game. You might have to grind to be a high enough level to do the main quests, so you better enjoy the world and the combat. Finally, here's my diagram of Breath of the Wild. So here's the start, and then the little tutorial plateau. You could spend quite a lot of time in here and even do things out of order. And then there's the whole open world. Here you can do whatever you want to make yourself powerful enough to defeat Ganon in the end. If you're adept enough, you can even just skip straight to the end to fight Ganon. Nothing will completely stop you like an invisible wall, just some very tough enemies and all of the bosses you didn't kill from the main quest lines. So here I have the 4 main quest lines that you can just complete in any order. You could even say screw this one and just go straight to the end. There's also the quest to reclaim the Master Sword, but it's completely optional and you can beat the game without it, which is pure blasphemy for Zelda games. So much of the Zelda formula has become optional in favor of offering more freedom to the player. I really love how that's best exemplified by being able to skip to the main boss, while not making the rest of the game feel superfluous. And hey, just because Breath of the Wild is more open doesn't necessarily mean it's better. This can be overwhelming for some people, and linear games are also just fine. I can still have a bunch of fun with them. But man, I really love this game. This free structure encourages curiosity-driven exploration rather than objective-driven exploration in the open world. Instead of being constantly led by objective markers on the HUD or minimap, the game encourages you to look around and find things that interest you. The world is made dense by things you can interact with, like Korok puzzles, shrines, towers, enemy encampments, objects to collect, and oh my god, is that a dragon? All of these are littered across the map and contribute to making the player powerful enough to defeat Ganon, even the dragon. So traveling anywhere at any time will make you stronger. There's no wrong way to go about the game. Honestly though, I don't think about the goals or objective all that much while playing the game. I just enjoy the game in the moment and not worry about the stepping stones I would have to hop over to work towards an objective. It's almost an ADHD simulator as I switch my attention from walking towards a tower to solving a Korok puzzle, fighting some enemies, finding a shrine, and now I'm on the complete opposite side of where I'm supposed to be. Guess I'll do this storyline instead. Not only does the free structure apply to the open world, but it also applies to the story. Much of the story is told through flashbacks, where Link can recall memories at specific points on the map. And of course, the best way to find these memories is through exploration. However, the game sacrifices a focused narrative in favor of player freedom, which can be disappointing since the cast of characters seems so interesting. Another unconventional change for the Zelda franchise can be heard in the soundtrack. Usually the Zelda tracks are rousing and exciting. A grand adventure awaits you with each uplifting note. But with Breath of the Wild, it's different. As you ride your horse on the open fields of Hyrule again, it's no longer accompanied by the dulcet sounds of a digital trumpet, but by the sprinkle of piano notes that resembles the galloping of a horse. And much of the soundtrack is led by a piano, which doesn't make it very exciting. Oh, never mind. Of course, the soundtrack can be exciting when it needs to. But for most of the game, it's tranquil, serene. I know I said it was tragic that the Dark Souls soundtracks are gone from streaming, but at least they were available. Nintendo doesn't have any of their music on streaming services. That's free money they're missing out on. EA gets to keep their terrible Battlefield soundtrack on Spotify, but not our Nintendo. Couldn't be precious Nintendo, stealing us blind. And 2042 gets to be on Spotify? What a sick joke! Sure, they had a bit of the Super Mario Odyssey soundtrack for sale on iTunes, but neither the track nor iTunes itself exist anymore. Also, nobody really buys music unless it's on vinyl. Not only that, but they actively remove tracks from YouTube as well. I know the Switch is portable, but this can't be the only way I listen to Nintendo music. So, freedom within Breath of the Wild is what defines the game for me. It's the curiosity-driven experience that keeps me enthralled and engaged with the game, not quest markers and objectives. Almost everything in Breath of the Wild embraces this open style of gameplay, and it comes with a breath of fresh air for the Zelda franchise, reinventing it. Alright, let's see some articles. Many games are being compared to Breath of the Wild, so maybe these games also foster the same level of freedom in their design. Genshin Impact. I know Zach got some initial heat for copying Zelda. It's clearly inspired by it, and it embraces some of its design. If people are saying that these are the same games, I must have horribly misinterpreted Breath of the Wild, because in Genshin Impact,
there is no freedom. You are forever enslaved to the whims of the indifferent gacha lords as they tempt you with a chance to finally attain the voluptuous waifu or husbando you so deeply covet, having you fall into the sunk cost fallacy and engendering a false perception of karma, forever setting away for people gems before being infatuated by the next.
Anyways, that's not an ideal comparison, so let's take a look at another article. Okay, Pokemon Legends Arceus. They do look similar to each other, but Arceus is not really as open. It does not play the same as Breath of the Wild. Although, it does revolutionize the Pokemon formula, kinda like what Breath of the Wild did for Zelda, so maybe that's the essence of Breath of the Wild that these comparisons are based off of. Sonic Frontiers, yeah, I can see the similarities, even the soundtrack features a piano. But it isn't an open world game, it's an open zone game. It still could revolutionize Sonic, so there's an ongoing thread there. Halo Infinite. Open world, but linear, but revolutionizes Halo. Okay. Horizon Forbidden West. Wow, the game was already just like Breath of the Wild because it has a glider. Man, people could make these comparisons at the first sight of the game. And now I'm completely lost. These aren't even open world games. Or video games, actually. I guess Breath of the Wild isn't really about freedom or even revolutionizing a franchise. It's about a game with a big grassy area and has gliders and climbing. And that you could get some serious BOTW vibes from seeing an open field of green grass and piano playing softly in the background. Alright, now that we have defined what it means for a game to be Dark Souls and Breath of the Wild, we can finally take a look at Elden Ring. There's been a worrying trend of games with immense hype that launch at a rough and incomplete state, plagued by the successful business strategy of just finishing the game later. It would have been so easy to assume that Elden Ring would fall into the same trend, especially with how high the hype was, how little was shown, and how From Software was taking risks by making an open world game. But this is From Software we're talking about. They have been at a hot streak, wavering from making near-perfect games to absolute masterpieces.
Okay, let's party! Welcome to the White House.
And that streak has not ended with Elden Ring. Little did we realize is that these games were all side projects, that a decade worth of developing has culminated into this. This is like Orson Welles coming out with Citizen Kane and The Third Man, some of the most venerated films of all time, and saying this is just a side project. In reality, his magnum opus would be made 40 years later when he voiced Unicron in a glorified children's toy commercial. And that toy commercial still traumatizes me to this day. Alright, maybe not the best example. It's wonderful how uncompromising From Software is. It would have been so easy for Elden Ring to be swayed into becoming a live service game, or at least contain some microtransactions. There would be complaints, of course, but then we would understand how another developer has to cave into a more lucrative business model. But they remain stalwart and challenge almost everything that has become the norm. So of course I fell into the hype, and I'm so glad I did, as it contributed to making Elden Ring already one of my favorite games of all time. Nah, I'm kidding. This is my real list. I would have lost all faith in the gaming industry if Elden Ring, if From Software had failed and bungled everything. I probably would have stopped gaming altogether and go off to become a doctor and afford a home and not have to eat sleep for dinner. Oh, thank goodness, right? So Elden Ring, it's just Dark Souls with open world, right? Of course not. That's why I'm going to compare the game to Dark Souls and Breath of the Wild, and not talk about the game for its own merits, because how else can I quickly and effectively describe a video game? To me, Elden Ring shares much of the same essence as Dark Souls, and unsurprisingly, it's because they share much of the same DNA. It's just that the context is vastly different. Much like its predecessors, Elden Ring is challenging, but not impossible. I remember being at a convention that had a gaming area. In it were some PS5s with Elden Ring. Since I already had both, I didn't play with it much, but I got to see a lot of people play the game for the first time. I expected most people would spend time with the game by exploring the open world, but no, many of them just spent their time fighting the Tree Sentinel, or Margit. Instead of going around these bosses or turning back, many people just trapped themselves into only fighting the boss. Some definitely wanted to do it for the challenge, understandably so, but others genuinely didn't know that you could just leave. I remember talking to a guy that spent a while fighting a Tree Sentinel. I told him that you could just go around and explore the world to level up and make things easier. Then he told me, oh, you can level up? I thought the game was just hard. I was dumbfounded at first, but then I realized that this echoes exactly how I was when I first played Dark Souls. That people really just see Souls games as brutally hard and nothing more, and I was guilty of that too. That Dark Souls' reputation as the hardest game of all time still bleeds into Elden Ring, despite the vast open world. I also saw another guy that was an absolute maniac, killing everyone but the bosses. I saw how he assailed Vare without hesitation, deservedly so, except he never even spoke to him. Then he tried fighting the Tree Sentinel for a while, before giving up, moving on to the church, and then attacked Kale despite his passive behavior. It was like watching Patrick Bateman play Elden Ring, and this was definitely his first time playing a Souls game since he didn't ever target lock. Anyways, he also eventually gave up when he fought Margit. Obviously, being in a convention hall was not the most ideal environment for playing Elden Ring. It was more exciting to take turns fighting a boss rather than to explore the landscape. It was almost like a fighting game where people would take turns to bring down the undefeated champ. I'm sure people would play differently at home, but at least it was a way for some to demo the game. Although, I don't know how much it persuaded people to buy it if they came in with the expectation that it was a hard game, and then came out with that same impression, labeling the game off as just difficult, or not for me. I just don't know how much of these people saw how truly open the game is. How if you hit a wall fighting Margit, you could just turn around and explore all of this. I also made a diagram for Elden Ring, so same deal, start and end, but there are many circles and this represents the areas you can go to at a time before reaching some event. And the bosses would basically gatekeep each event. So this circle would represent all the open regions available, like Limgrave, Caelid, Lernia, each immense and dense. And I didn't even mention the underground. So this little circle represents the dungeon, and then there are bosses in there you have to beat to get to the Erdtree. After that, there are more areas available and the game kinda just funnels in naturally as you unlock more areas. Then there's Crumbling Farmerzula, and then the Gauntlet of Bosses at the very end. Right, but the game is so open, and basically all you're doing is buffing yourself till you can beat up all the required bosses of the game. If adept enough, you can streamline through the game to the end, but this is incredibly difficult. Sadly, you can't skip to the final boss like in Zelda, but you can skip a fair amount of things. I mean, even the little circles are big. They're as big as an entire area in Dark Souls. It's all just relative within the outer region being even bigger. There's so much to explore and everything contributes to tailoring your experience. You gain XP or runes to level up, and they can be found by killing enemies or found as an item. You can also sell almost anything to gain runes. And it's not just runes that make you more powerful. There are weapons, abilities, siege, spells, spirit summons. So much has been added to make Elden Ring more adaptive. You are free to make yourself more powerful in the way you want to. Sure, there are blockades in the form of bosses, but you are free to overcome that blockade in your way. Whether it be through brute strengths, pure magic, or complete inaction and just let your summons do all your work. The game is easier and yet harder in some areas compared to other Souls games. Because of how much is available to the player at any given moment, From Software kinda went all out with the bosses in this game. In some of the older Souls games like Demon Souls and Dark Souls, the bosses aren't actually the hardest part of the game. It's navigating to the boss that is more difficult, to where the level itself is an extension of the boss. But with Elden Ring, undoubtedly these are the toughest collection of bosses, especially the demigods. And of course their themes remain just as epic and memorable. There's so many tracks to love, but the theme for Lich Dragon Fortisax stood out for me. Didn't expect to hear organs go this hard. It's like if Hans Zimmer was summoned and made a track for Elden Ring. Some themes don't have to be epic either. The track for the Regal Ancestor Spirit is an otherworldly experience on its own. Actually, much like the rest of the game, the music has also been adapted into the open world. Most of the game isn't silent. There are now ambient tracks everywhere. I like how even online invaders get their own themes now. The track for the final fight is brilliant as well. The game literally has the anime moment where they play the opening in the final fight to hype you up. It's the same theme that plays in the start screen, the intro, and even in the trailers all the way at the beginning. We've been primed for this fight from the very start. It's great that they found a theme to hammer down on. Yet again, I also failed to realize the implications of the final battle. But regardless, I was able to comprehend more of the narrative than in Dark Souls. The lore and presentation is more concrete, and this could be because of George R.R. Martin's contribution, but I don't know, as I forgot that he was even involved. It's evident that a story does exist, but I find it more fun to focus on my own story and recall the memorable moments that happened to me. And to me, the essence of both adaptability and freedom is found within Elden Ring. Which finally leads to answering the big question. We decided that Dark Souls is just a hard game, and Breath of the Wild is just an open game. Therefore, I conclude that Elden Ring is the Dark Souls of Breath of the Wild. Because it's hard. That's it. Yeah, but that kinda makes Elden Ring sound like it's from Zelda, when it's not. It's from Dark Souls. Alright, then Elden Ring is the Breath of the Wild of Dark Souls, because it's open world now, and it's also the first game to have a dedicated jump button, like Zelda. Yeah, but the grass isn't green enough, there's no piano, the vibes just aren't there. And it doesn't have... Actually, what am I doing? This is frivolous. These reasons don't make sense. Why am I following what everyone says despite knowing for myself that this can't be right? Dark Souls isn't just hard, and Breath of the Wild isn't just open. They're both so much more. They're more than just their mechanics, their environment, their characters, their music, or their story. They're more than the sum of their parts, a gestalt. I know the popular opinions are generally right, that's what makes them popular, but they can be misguided as well. And I think I understand why these comparisons are made now. It is easier to describe a game using existing concepts and interests rather than doing so from scratch. If I wanted to quickly and accurately describe how Dark Souls' map is linear and yet intertwined, I could describe it as that of Metroidvania games. Granted, only if that person has an existing schema of what Metroidvania is. If I wanted to pitch a certain game, I can cater to people's heuristics and give them a quick description by saying, Fatal Frame is like Pokemon Snap, but spooky. But sometimes I'll have to make some tangential comparisons if I really want to cater to someone's interests. Right, if I'm trying to convince my cousin to play Breath of the Wild, I might say it's just like Fortnite. It has a glider, it's in a big area, got cartoony graphics, and then you can shoot piggy goblins instead of Boruto's dad or whatever. And that's where some unfaithful comparisons are made. I don't blame some of those that write articles online. They constantly have to compete for attention. So they make headlines that spotlight and compare other games to get people to click on their articles. You can't just say a new game is difficult, you gotta be more scintillating and say that it's Dark Souls to garner attention. Some garner genuine curiosity. Okay, I like that game, let's take a look. Meanwhile, others garner clicks out of spite and confusion. What are you talking about? Some comparisons become so vague, exaggerated, and ubiquitous, it eventually engenders a shallow perception of a game like Dark Souls. So, what can we do to do better? Well, not much, since this stems from bigger issues relating to online internet culture. People are going to constantly vie for attention online, and making these comparisons will sometimes net it, regardless of intention. To mitigate, we could try to make more succinct comparisons, relying on comparing games only if they're truly relevant to each other. We could also specify our comparisons, talking about how one game might share an element with another, instead of just broadly claiming that one game is like another. Like I said though, these comparisons are inevitable, but it also helps to not feed into them if they are nonsensical. Collectively, we should do better to be apt about all of our statements, but I know that can't always be, as our speech is limited online, and we can't be meaningful about every single statement we make. Really, I just want people to move away from hackneyed comparisons, as it could be detrimental to the reputation of a game like Dark Souls. It's like when everyone hated Nickelback or Pineapple on Pizza because the internet said so. Just because we don't have an opinion doesn't mean we have to blindly accept the popular. We should try to form it ourselves. And I feel that more people would enjoy Dark Souls, but its reputation as being plainly difficult prevents people from realizing the other aspects of the game. Like I said before, the game is challenging, yes, but never impossible. A major component of Dark Souls is modifying your experience through leveling up and finding items. Another component is just giving in to feeling lost, forgetting about your objectives, and simply wander around the beautiful world crafted before you, which resembles my experience of the other game discussed. Wandering around was part of why I loved Breath of the Wild, and I want to find more games that encourage that. I don't want more games that just has green grass and piano. I want more games that open up and stop coddling us and just let us roam. And I didn't find that with other open world games. Instead, I found it through totally different games like Outer Wilds, Super Mario Odyssey, and of course Dark Souls, which further convinced me that Elden Ring will be the next game to completely immerse me. But not every game needs to be as open as Breath of the Wild. Even classic Zelda can still be fun. I hope that Elden Ring can drop Dark Souls' reputation and move on from being just a hard game. That people would move beyond using it as a descriptor for how hard— oh, come on!